And we are back. Your man Diamond K in here, the Diamond K Show on the all new radioonfire.com. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for tuning in. So, earlier this week, the passing of retired General Colin Powell was announced. And what I want to do is I want to dive in and really look at General Powell, at his legacy, at a lot of things about him. Was he a friend or was he a foe of the American people? That's what we're going to talk about today. There were many American generals in the last century that were worse than Colin Powell, right? Men who also died, obviously. Like Colin Powell, they were celebrated for their accomplishments. And Colin Powell had many accomplishments. General Curtis LeMay, firebombed Tokyo. Nearly incited a third world war on multiple occasions. That general was celebrated when he passed away. Douglas MacArthur provoked the Korean War, attempted to start a nuclear war, celebrated when he died. Tommy Franks, who oversaw the invasion of Iraq, to name a few. These are just a few, right? Generals who were, in my opinion, worse than Colin Powell, but they were also celebrated. Colin Powell is probably going to be remembered as a hero, I suppose, as a But when we talk about Colin Powell, it is complicated. It's complicated. Powell was uniquely bad. But, I want to be objective here, right? Fundamentally, he's a bureaucrat. He was a PR guy for the American political and military establishment. He was the PR person. He was like the mouthpiece for those folks. Colin Powell was popular. And because he was popular, the powers that be used Colin Powell to do their dirty work. They used Colin Powell to push things on the American people because Colin Powell was popular. It was easy for them to do that. And here's the thing. Here's why I say that he is uniquely bad. Because Colin Powell was aware that he was being used by the political and military establishment. This was no secret. Colin Powell knew it, which to me makes it even worse. It's one thing if you could play the innocent deer in the headlights. You know what I mean? I didn't know anything, but he knew. He knew what he was doing. So whether we're talking about the Vietnam War, whether we're talking about Iraq, he was used, knowingly used, and pushed lies on the American people that cost American lives. So when I said that he was popular, he could have run for president. And many thought that he was going to run for president in the 90s. So this popularity that Colin Powell enjoyed, even after the debacle of the Iraq War and the George W. Bush administration political mess. But what is ironic is that when this general is remembered, many of his former deputies still refer to the Secretary of State bearing striking resemblance to cults of personalities. Some talk about a military dictatorship with which Powell allied and fought against his whole life. Most of the obituaries that you're going to see of Colin Powell, who passed away from complications of COVID-19, they're going to list all of his basic facts in life, his career, of course, born of Jamaican immigrant parents, New York, South Bronx, went to City College. That set him on a path that would take him further than any black man had gone previously in the U.S. government. Set him on a path for success. And he was successful. Colin Powell had the kind of career that, he had the kind of career that will cause him to be remembered, had it not been for some of the other things that he did. But I want to say this, he's not the only one, as we talked about earlier. Colin Powell's not the only one that pushed lies on the American people. I mean, the list is long. Now, when you hear, obviously, Colin Powell's friends talk about him, say humility and he was a nice guy, and that may be true. That may be true. Humility. He was a man of many ideas, but he wasn't ideological. That is what the current Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said about Colin Powell this week. He populated the arc of his light with people he was good to. A former Powell subordinate, now at the American Enterprise Institute, said in The Atlantic. Obviously, family and friends heartbroken with the loss of Colin Powell. And, him passing away from COVID-19, a lot of folks initially in the conservative corners talking about the fact that he was fully vaccinated and he passed away from COVID. So they thought that was something to say, hey, vaccine doesn't work. Fully vaccinated guy dies. The general, vaccine doesn't work. That's what a lot of folks were saying. Of course, supporters of the COVID-19 vaccine say, oh, no, he was sick. He had multiple diseases that were affecting the efficacy of the vaccine. So you can't say that. So they frequently will say, well, the vaccine only works if you're in perfect health. If you're in bad health, then the vaccine doesn't work. We still want you to take it, but the vaccine doesn't really work if you're in bad health. No, everybody's in bad health. Everybody got something wrong with them, right? Something. But Colin Powell, friend or foe? Was Colin Powell a bad general? Was he a good general? How do we weigh good and bad generals? Colin Powell was single-handedly responsible for most of the horrors to which his name can be attached. He knew what he was doing. Helped cover up a lot of things, smuggling arms from the Army to the CIA for the infamous Iran-Contra deals, obliterating a fleeing Iraqi army on the quote-unquote highway of death in the Gulf War, most infamously lying for the Bush administration to generate a fig leaf of international support that they needed to invade and occupy Iraq. He lied. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Of course, that is widely known now. And some of his supporters will say, oh, no, he apologized for that. He said he was sorry. And as many conservatives do, they say they're sorry, something was bad. That just means it all is supposed to go away. Just like with January 6th. They just say, well, we agree that it's bad. Let's stop talking about it, right? He apologized and said, he messed up after he got out of government. But throughout Colin Powell's career, you can find a kind of counter history that took place over the last 50 years or so. Now, this is not things that the obituaries are going to highlight about Colin Powell. They're not going to talk about that. But a significant part of Colin Powell's history is a story of covert actions, overt lies, lies by omission, and most of all, basic character tests of decency that he rarely passed in his political, professional life. Now, I can't speak for his personal life. I cannot speak for that. But he did make out just fine in the private sector. He set himself up pretty nicely. Pretty nicely. So Colin Powell's military service began in Vietnam. Vietnam, another lie perpetrated against the American people. We should not have been in Vietnam. Right? And anyway, he participated in the cover-up of a massacre in Vietnam, failing to investigate claims of the atrocities reported by American soldiers to military leaders. Colin Powell was involved in the cover-up of that. Once he got back to the U.S. in the 1970s, he got an MBA and a Nixon White House fellowship where he became close with future Reagan Defense Secretary and indicted Iran-Contra co-conspirator Caspar Weinberger. He started making those connections that he would keep over the years, allowing him to be the mouthpiece, one of the mouthpieces for the political and military establishment. So there was a stint in South Korea, points of command in Kansas, Colorado, and then Colin Powell relocates to D.C. in 1983. At that time, Colin Powell became now Secretary Weinberger's military assistant. So through connections that he made during the Nixon administration, he moved up. Now he's making moves. So he helped oversee the invasion of Grenada that year. For those that remember that, oversaw the invasion of this small country. He assisted Weinberger's controversial request to ramp up military spending. And even though the Soviet Union was declining, Cold War was coming to an end, they upped the military spending. Powell was a key military player in Ronald Reagan's plan to resurrect America's Cold War. They wanted to keep the Cold War going. Why? Let's keep this money flowing, taking over countries, dealing drugs. They were doing all kind of stuff. So Colin Powell, as I said, a willing participant. We're going to get later on to the, how they tried to frame this later, but he's a willing participant. 1986, the day after Reagan officially signed off on the illegal covert arms for hostage deal with Iran, Colin Powell played his part in this scandal. And of course, the scandal known as Iran-Contra. So that scandal really took over the airwaves in America when the crap really hit the fan. You had the president, Ronald Reagan, giving his seal of approval on the selling of anti-tank missiles. Next step was to move the weapons from the Army to the CIA, and they handled the sale. So once again, a question of, how do you say this? Due diligence. A question of due diligence. This is something that we repeatedly see falling on the desk of Colin Powell. Due diligence. Information comes to you and you check it out. But over and over again, when you look at the history of Colin Powell, he just rubber stamps things. That's why he ended up giving the information that was incorrect about the weapons of mass destruction. Not doing your due diligence. He's a general. Right? He's a general. Not doing his due diligence. Whatever they say, I'm just going to go with that. Right? I'm just going to go with that. Powell was soon warned by a Pentagon advisor that there was no lawful way to transfer weapons without notifying Congress. But as other presidents tried, Donald Trump, disrespecting Congress, there's been others. I don't want to say Donald Trump's the only one, but many times administrations try to skirt around Congress. Let me see what I can do without Congress. I mean, George Bush did it as well, trying to get around Congress. And that is what you call a slippery slope. So he's notified that there is no lawful way to transfer weapons without notifying Congress. No matter. Powell wrote this in his memoirs that because of President Reagan's secret order for the arms sale, the deal was kosher. It was all good. So, aspects of this obviously not legal. Steering the profits from the sales to the right-wing militants strictly disallowed. Congress, I mean, this is not supposed to be happening. I mean, per U.S. laws, right? I mean, if you want to if you want to follow the laws, this shouldn't be happening. But the whole thing was covered up, and you know, the scheme was still foolhardy, foolhardy, but now legal. Colin Powell says this later. Now it's legal. The criminal nature of this, what became known as the Iran-Contra affair, grew out of other elements, according to Colin Powell. Oh, no, not the stuff that we did. We're talking about other stuff, right? And speaking of other stuff, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney. Remember him? He's someone who used Colin Powell as a mouthpiece to push propaganda and lies on the American people. We're going to get to that, though. We're going to get to that. Let's do this. You listen to the Diamond K Show here on Radio on Fire. Colin Powell, friend or foe? We're going to talk about this more after this. Welcome back to Diamond K Show here on RadioOnFire.com. We are talking about Colin Powell, friend or foe. Of course, Colin Powell recently passing away from COVID-19. And, I thought about this, and I said that obviously with the general passing away, there are going to be all of these praises heaped upon him and his many accomplishments. But I wanted to look at some of the aspects of his career that are not going to be talked about in the obituaries. Some things that are true. I'm not disparaging him. I'm just speaking about things that happened. And really looking at the fact whether Colin Powell was a friend or foe of the American people. Is this someone who should be celebrated? And yes, he was the first, African American in a lot of different roles and positions. But what did he do in those positions? There were flagrantly illegal actions. Iran had been under an American arms embargo since 1979. Since 1979. But still, the weapons from the Army to the CIA under weird circumstances that took place. Knowing that a justification would be moot if the arms were going to a foreign country, and these arms were, an action that required disclosure to the U.S. Congress. Powell drafted a memo about this, which he passed on to the National Security Advisor, because they wanted to get this done. They wanted to get the sale of these arms done, even though it shouldn't have been happening the way that they were doing it. By the end of the year, as Iran-Contra forced the exit of his bosses, Colin Powell was tapped as Reagan's Deputy National Security Advisor before assuming the full position in 1987. So you had the people that were above him being forced to resign, forced out, and now he moves into that role. A couple of years later, President George H.W. Bush names Colin Powell the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So this is some of the things that you're going to see in his obituary, and people talk about him. The commander of the American military, the youngest ever. He was 52 years old. And again, the first for a Black American. Commendable. Commendable. Colin Powell became the chairman exactly at the moment the Soviet Union began to fall apart. They were no longer a plausible military threat. So between Colin Powell's assumption of the chairmanship in 1989 and the official crumbling and dissolution of the USSR at the end of 1991, the general moved out of the Pentagon's and Reagan's shadow and into the limelight. He started getting that shine on him. He started being on the stage, right? Started being on the stage. Colin Powell, friend or foe? Friend or foe? I don't know. Colin Powell's career continued. It was like a guided missile. How much higher will he go? Was the headline in the Los Angeles Times magazine in April of 1991. Then we had that event, the Gulf War. Many will remember the Gulf War. The summer before, Iraq's economy had been in all kind of chaos and upheaval. So there was a stalemate ending of the Iran-Iraq war. Saddam Hussein found his regime in debt. They needed money. They owed the U.S. money. They owed neighboring Arab countries money. But the neighboring countries had been happy to supply credit for weapons for the decade-long war against Iran. But after Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, the U.S. military, led by Colin Powell, launched Operation Desert Shield. So you had this, coalition for a bigger, broader war. And a 600,000 troop presence was built up in the region, mainly in Saudi Arabia. Mainly. Colin Powell, friend or foe? So we're talking about this. Colin Powell. Later, the general recalled this moment as a make or break test of will. He said this: it's important to plant the American flag in the Saudi desert as soon as possible. Powell had himself conceded that he thought that he was reasonably sure that the Iraqis had not yet decided to invade Saudi Arabia. But better safe than sorry. So we're talking about this, and the reason why I'm talking about this, the reason why I'm going through some of these moments that many people know about Colin Powell. Many people know these things, but when we talk about Operation Desert Steel, Desert Shield, which became Operation Desert Storm in January of 1991, what happened is that the American and the Allied forces began airstrikes on Iraqi positions. These positions that were in Kuwait City. So a program of press censorship was enacted. There was a 48-hour news blackout. So when this war began, when the ground war began, there were a number of restrictions. Why? What did Americans see or at home? What were we seeing here? Or rather, who did we see? In addition to the real life video game, the spectacle of war, there was night vision explosions, um, and there was a quick victory. There was a whole lot of Colin Powell on TV. There was a lot of propaganda pitched to the American people. Colin Powell, I talk about him often as a PR person, public relations. He's very, very aware and conscious of his image. Many of the reporters at the time treated Colin Powell like he was the story, talking about his career and trying to speculate whether he had political aspirations. So they were pushing this on him then. So we're talking about the early 90s. His popularity is steadily growing. And it seemed like he was priming himself for that. You know how they do. And they'll say, no, you should do this. You're like, oh, no. They ask you, no, you should do this. No, not me. There's other people. I'm not worth. He was doing that kind of thing. Right. So January 23rd, 1991, there was a press conference. And Colin Powell was there alongside Dick Cheney. And they declared that the air battle against Saddam Hussein had been won. But the Americans and the Allied forces should be ready for a ground war against the Iraqis. So this time, Powell said that the U.S. Army was targeting nuclear and chemical and biological weapons targets and defended himself against one of the few critical press reports that had surfaced. Stuff started coming out, you know how stuff leaks out. Stuff's going to get out. And he tried to address it. He said that there was a story earlier today about the infant formula factory, Colin Powell said. It's not an infant formula factory anymore. And he talked about the chemical plant in Libya making aspirin. He goes on to say that it was actually a biological weapons factory. Of that, we are sure, and we have taken it out. But a CNN reporter discovered, this is after visiting the site, discovered that, in fact, the factory was producing baby formula. These are just some of the lies that are told. And as you can see, a pattern has developed. We haven't got to the point where he lies to everyone about weapons of mass destruction. We haven't gotten there yet. But this is a lie along those terms, along those lines. And in 1992, they were even starting to float Powell's name as a possible VP for Bush. That's how popular he'd gotten. In 1995, Colin Powell wrote an autobiography, My American Journey. It was the fastest selling book in Random House history, according to the company. The general received a $6 million advance payment, and more than 1 million copies were printed. It was printed at the time of the book's release. And Powell said, I haven't seen this many people since I went to Colin Powell's book signing yesterday. Senator Bob Dole said, Bob Dole was actually a potential political rival, and he was a future GOP presidential nominee himself. Of course, Colin Powell did not run for president, but his name was floated in every election between 1998 and 2016. I mean, the general was unable to square the circle of being a Black Republican, though. That was something that is difficult to do. He was popular. He checked all of the boxes at the time. And he had the right air for the time. But of course, like I said, he didn't run for president. And I think that his best shot for office would have been in 1996. Back then. But he did not do it. And he said that his wife felt that it was too dangerous. There's always the fear of assassination. And, that was something that weighed heavily on him. Right? So, of course, he goes on. 1997, Powell created with his wife America's Promise, which was a nonprofit promoting youth. And they were able to get multi-million-dollar donations and make connections across corporate America. Best Buy, Kellogg, Taco Bell, many connections. He's able to network. I talked about it in the private sector. He's able to play the game. He knew the game. According to one study, 70% of the 3- and 4-star generals and admirals who retired between 2009 and 2011 subsequently took jobs at defense contractors. So, what about the sponsors of America's Promise? The Kellogg Company. The Kellogg Company is a perfect example of what happens when corporate America takes the lead in helping our nation's at-risk young people, Colin Powell said. Thank you, Kellogg, for your commitment to the children of America referring to the company's $30 million in-kind donation, which would be in the form of messages about America's promise on 100 million of its cereal packages for the next 14 months. This is the most cereal packaging space that Kellogg had ever dedicated to a socially responsible effort. This is according to Michigan's Battle Creek Inquirer. So the year before, Kellogg had cut almost 800 jobs at its Battle Creek plant. Now, Battle Creek, Michigan is the city that both Kellogg and Post cereals were created. So 2 months after Powell's love fest with Kellogg, ununionized workers at the cereal company narrowly ratified a contract approving an hourly cost of living raise of $1.43. By September 1999, Kellogg workers in Battle Creek were told to expect 550 more layoffs. So the Battle Creek Kellogg facility still stands. It still has some people working there. They are now on strike, though. And they got informed last month that Kellogg will be cutting more than 200 jobs by 2023. Maybe they shouldn't have gave Powell all that money, right? Colin Powell, though, was in no such dire straits. He was good. At the time that he was, dating Kellogg to support needy children, Powell was also stacking up money. He was building up a very, very considerable bankroll. So since his retirement from the military 7 years prior, Colin Powell has become wealthy through high-priced speaking engagements. And this is something that we see politicians do and military people do. I'm not faulting him for these things. I'm just stating the facts, right? So he worked that circuit. He had a hit, a best-selling book that was out. So he's working a circuit. And the New York Times reported in January 2001, he had amassed an investment portfolio in the excess of $28.2 million. This was according to his financial disclosure statement. So he is doing his thing. And, I guess you can't really fault him for doing, he's working the system, working with the system. So after 9/11 and throughout 2002, in multiple accounts, Colin Powell claims to have watched others with more clout in the Bush White House successfully peddle their obsession with invading Iraq. During this time, the country was put on high alert. Any of you that remember how it was in America after 9/11? High alert. That's when the things at the airport changed. The Patriot Act was passed. DHS was created. Afghanistan was invaded. Anthrax was mailed. I'm just painting a picture for that time period. It was a crazy time. Colin Powell told the New York Times that the American people wanted somebody killed. That probably was true. That probably was true. Robert Draper, New York Times reporter, and the 2020 book on the lead up to the invasion to start a war. He's the author of that. So Powell said that his hesitancy on Iraq made him more powerful enemies in the Bush world. Talking about the president. He said that his colleagues, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, they became enemies. And I guess that's important because they were pulling the strings. If you let Colin Powell say it, if you listen to what he had to say, he was on the losing side of an argument. Of course, when they're painting the picture, they're the heroes, right? And so in Draper's book, he talks about Powell being flawed yet fundamentally noble, right? You know, he got some stuff wrong with him, but on the inside, he's a good person. You know, General Powell's contributions on balance, likely it strengthened the cause for war in many people's eyes. So in the summer, so we're talking about August of 2002, the author, the writer, the reporter identifies a key decision point. Key decision point. Powell told Bush that he should go to the United Nations. So, you know, rather than voice doubts about the so-called intelligence, remember I was talking about due diligence. Instead of saying that something is wrong with this so-called intelligence, this intelligence that they were using to make the case for war, instead of that, and you know, this foolhardiness of an invasion, General Powell tells President Bush that he should go to the United Nations. So what does that mean? Why is he going to the United Nations? What is he trying to do? What is the reasoning behind this? They gotta sell this to the people. They've got to sell this to the allies. They got to build a coalition of the willing. So they had to sell this. So it was an advisor of Bush, Karl Rove, who suggested that Colin Powell be the one to make that case to the world. And the world was watching. The United Nations inspectors, of course, found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Right? In January 2003, in a one-on-one meeting in the Oval Office, President Bush asked Colin Powell straight up, "Are you with me on this?" The president obviously wanted Colin Powell to be the one arguing for invading Iraq at the United Nations. Powell knew what was going on. Powell also knew what this meant. But consistently, he allowed himself to be the PR person, the public relations person for the political and military establishment. If Colin Powell says no to President Bush at that time, January 13th, 2003, if Colin Powell says no, it would have realistically prompted his resignation, but also Bush's case for war would have been more difficult. But that's not what happened, obviously. Weeks before delivering the speech, Colin Powell was given a text prepared by Dick Cheney, Chief of Staff Scooter Libby, right? According to Draper, Draper said that Powell viewed this suspiciously. In particular, the claims tying Saddam Hussein to Osama bin Laden. Reportedly, Colin Powell asked Dick Cheney's aides, "You guys really believe all this shit?" But that's not how he sold it to the people. On February 5th, Colin Powell went to the UN and, it can never be forgotten. He delivered lie after lie about Saddam Hussein's, biological, chemical, possibly nuclear stockpile. So there was a vial in his hand, all represented by the teaspoon of simulated anthrax in his hand, using that to make the point, make the case. My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources, General Powell declared. These are not assertions, he said. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. That's what he said. So among those conclusions, the very evidence that Powell had privately crapped on, Iraq harbors a deadly terrorist network headed blah, 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 blah. Associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his Al Qaeda lieutenants, blah, 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 blah. Now, Colin Powell delivered these lies convincingly, especially if that's what you wanted to hear. But these were lies that he told the American people. Colin Powell, friend or foe? I mean, he has a memorial that's coming up. The memorial service for Colin Powell is set for November the 5th. And they are going to cart him out like he's the biggest, the biggest American hero that we have seen. But I wanted to provide some context a little bit. So, without much of a role in the actual war itself, and being widely known, that he was, squeamish in the cabinet, Powell was pushed out of the administration. He served the purpose that they want. Cheney and folks pushed him out. Once Bush got reelected in 2004, Colin Powell resigned. Now, looking back, he left at a good time. The Iraq War, 2004, was not yet as unpopular as it would become. And according to polls, Colin Powell's approval rating at the time was 87%. So what did Colin Powell, possibly the most widely liked man in American politics at that time. What did he do with his newfound status? What do you think he did? Of course, he went to Silicon Valley and started making money, or kept making money, because, you know, that's what he did. And you can run down the list of all of the different things that he did. But one interesting thing that he did was he severed ties with the Republican Party. 2008, he endorses Barack Obama. And, you know, his bipartisan status was affirmed for the time. And he cashed in again. You know, he was a businessman. I'll give him that. He took board seats at the top 50 federal contractor Salesforce, the fuel cell maker Bloom Energy, making money, right? Making money. And there was a lot of things that he did to make money. When looking back at the UN speech later, Colin Powell said, "I knew I didn't have any choice." He said this to Robert Draper about the book leading up to the war, that book. "What choice did I have? He's the president," he said. So conveniently, he will play with that. But he knew what was going on. And as he told Cheney aides, it was all BS. When he asked him, do y'all believe this? Y'all really believe this? Colin Powell is definitely someone who will be remembered, the former United States Secretary of State. He's a diplomat, 4-star general. First African American Secretary of State. These are some things that are going to be highlighted in his obituary. But make no mistake, Colin Powell killed hundreds of thousands of people. Generals do have this type of blood on their hands. Did Colin Powell con the American people? The American Prospect says so. But I don't want people to be disillusioned. Powell had a great journey. So when we look back at Colin Powell, I asked the question many times during this broadcast, many times over the last hour. Was Colin Powell a friend or foe? He died October 18th, age of 84. The age of 84. So we talked about many things, from a perspective that you're not going to hear in the obituary. They're going to gloss over a lot of the things that we talked about today. They're going to gloss over the lies that he's told. They're going to say, oh, he apologized for that. He apologized for this. He was the first Black this. He was the first black that. And I'm not trying to minimize his great accomplishments. What I'm trying to do is provide perspective for the bad stuff that he did, in addition to the history making things that he did. Where does he rank in the list of bad generals over the years? I don't know where he ranks. I don't know where he ranks. But as I said in the start, he was a bureaucrat and a public relations man for the American political and military establishment. So if that is something that should be applauded, which I don't think it is, but if that's something that should be applauded, then go ahead, clap your hands. But on November the 5th, when his memorial service happens, they are going to paint this guy as damn near a saint. I think that's what's going to happen. I think that's how they're going to present him. I think that's how they're going to present him. He had a hell of a career. I'd like to see the movie. I like to see the movie on Colin Powell. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, at The Diamond K Show, at Radio on Fire. Of course, I will be back on Monday with more of the show and all of that.